Space, a common point of origin. We will share Star Trek with the world, inspire new conversations, and create the future of humanity together. Good afternoon, Casperia Con. For those of you just joining us, I'm Captain Barbara MacDonald of the Starship Inspire. Thank you for being here. A little bit about me. I, in real life, am an infectious disease nurse. I'm also a writer and a filmmaker. I am a potter. I love to sing. And about my Trek life, so that you know, full disclosure, Voyager is my show and Janeway is my captain. I want to tell you a little bit about Watch Trek Look Forward's mission. What we are doing here is using Star Trek as a foundation to create a bright future for humanity. We've developed a way to track our progress. You can log the episodes that you watch on our website, and then we can look and see as this spreads around the world, like, well, not a virus, but something really good. And we can see who's watching and get some opinions about what they think. And together, we can start making progress toward what's really important to us. We host monthly events addressing what's important to people, and you are more than welcome to come, and we hope to see you at all of those. Basically, we learn from Star Trek by looking at what inspires us. And what I'm talking about by inspiration is this. Criticism is cheap. In fact, it's almost impossible to avoid. It's everywhere on the internet, and you can't even really get away from it in your own head. So our goal is to provide something of a lot more value. So to expose us to another way of thinking, we look at Star Trek through the lens of inspiration. What inspires us about Star Trek? What is there for us to learn from this? Now, on the subject of how we talk about things, I want to take just a minute to frame our discussion today and how we speak to each other. We're facing a challenging moment in history as a planet, as a people. Many people are experiencing a hardship such as they have never dealt with before, and this pandemic has impacted everyone in some way. So the first thing to do is to acknowledge that. The next challenge is how to handle it. Our mission here today is to bring you accurate information and to answer your questions. In doing so, we're all going to make a difference together. This is a space dedicated to listening and learning rather than judgment or evaluation. So in order to listen, we as human beings have to learn to set aside what's going on in our heads all the time. I'm talking about the little voice in your head that's always commenting on something. It might have just said, well, Captain Mac definitely has a little voice in her head. That's the voice I'm talking about. So here's a tip. As long as you're listening to that little voice, you can't truly listen to anything or anyone else. So I invite you to notice when you find yourself listening to that little voice, and then to set it aside and choose to listen to whomever is speaking with the intention of truly getting what it is that they have to say. This is also an opportunity to consider forgiveness. Now, you might not have thought that when you came to a talk about COVID-19 that forgiveness would come up, but I think it's important, so I'm going to take a moment to discuss it. What I mean by forgiveness is not excusing or ignoring behaviors that don't work. Some things that human beings do, it just doesn't work. What I mean by forgiveness is deciding to give people the grace and space to grow from their mistakes. As such, I want to ask you for your forgiveness ahead of time, and perhaps retrospectively already, for any mistakes I'm going to make with you today or might have already done. Please forgive me. Thank you. This is just one way that we can start to make progress as a society. If we have a place where people can make mistakes and grow and learn from them and get supported in their growth process, we can start to make progress. All right, so now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our special guests. I'm going to ask you guys to say hello and come off camera as I introduce you. And we'll start with Dr. Paul Pottinger. Dr. Pottinger is a professor of infectious disease at the University of Washington in Seattle. He directs the Antimicrobial Stewardship Program, the Infectious Disease Training Program, the Infectious Disease Clinic, and the Infectious Disease Consult section. He's a member of UW's medical, technical COVID-19 response team. Mountaineering is his passion.
Greetings, Earthlings. Thanks, Captain. Really appreciate it. Everything you just said resonates with me so much. We'll have a few minutes to talk shortly, and those themes that you raise, it's part and parcel of what we do in infectious disease. So we're so happy to have you not only here today, but your other hobby, i.e. your profession. We're glad to have you doing that too. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pottinger. Next, I will introduce Dr. Gary Preston. Dr. Preston's background is in microbiology, and his interest in microbial ecology led to research and work in infectious disease epidemiology. He has served as an epidemiologist and director of infection prevention programs for hospitals in Washington State since 1977. Please say hello, Dr. Preston.
Thank you. Many of the points Barbara has just made are some that we will hopefully address in the context of coronavirus. I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Preston. And last but certainly not least, we are very proud to introduce Mr. Robert Picardo. Now, Mr. Picardo, whom we all know and love as Star Trek Voyager's Doctor, has obviously had a brilliant career in the performing arts. His credits are many and varied, including music, theater, Broadway, television, and film. And I should probably also nod to Alfonso's YouTube panache, which I appreciate. But moving on, our focus today is on COVID-19. Oh, Robert, would you like to say hello as well? I did mean to give you that opportunity.
Thank you. I think I'm unmuted, right? Because I have a habit. Oh, good. All right. Well, we'll decide if that's a good thing or not soon. I'm delighted to be part of this. I'm always in awe of the real people in medicine. That was my original career goal in life. I was pre-med in college till I took a left turn. I am married to a physician, so I have enormous respect for the medical community. And even though I'm only a make-believe doctor, I'm happy to be here to draw some analogies, I guess, between what we did in science fiction, the future we dreamed of, and what lessons I think are pertinent to our real world that Star Trek often demonstrates. So thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. And I do just want to ask you, how would you like to be addressed, both by those of us asking you questions and by those of us on the panel?
Well, I haven't been knighted yet, so Bob will be fine.
Okay. Thank you, Bob, for the clarification. We'll call you that. Our focus today on the COVID-19 pandemic makes Macrocosm an ideal choice of Star Trek episodes. So let's just start by taking a question about the episode before we hop into the discussion of what COVID's been up to here on Earth. Commander Cannon, are you ready with that particular question? And I think we may need to have you call on Kelvin. Kelvin, and I believe we're looking for Marvelous to ask.
Very good. So yes, we have
special
guests coming to join us today from across the world indeed. The first question will be from an individual named Marvelous, who I'll allow to introduce themselves, I think. Hello.
Perfect. Kelvin, are you able to come on camera and bring us Marvelous? We would love to see their face.
Yes, okay.
Hello, welcome.
Right. Hi. We're so excited. Here is Aquarogen, and there is Marvelous.
Marvelous, welcome to Casperia Con. Please ask Bob your question.
Okay. I want to ask what program was used to run the hologram? The program used to run the emergency medical hologram. That's what I want to know.
You want to know what program was used to, what kind of software?
Yeah.
You know, it's 300 years in the future, so I'm guessing that it's a kind of it's a very advanced program. I remember when I was given the role, and it had to be explained to me how, as a hologram, a projection of light, I could handle real instruments, and I never quite understood that, but I pretended as though I did. But I cannot tell you. I suspect that it's what would the future of what would 24th century software be? I don't know. I like to think it would be Mac.
Okay.
Thank you, Bob. I just want to take half a second while we have all of those lovely faces on camera to let everybody know who they are and where they came from. And it'll just be a minute. This is a school in Nigeria. They are dedicated to bringing the space program and space technology to Africa and to having Africa represented and in on the game of getting humanity into space. And they want to say hello to you so badly, they can't hardly stand it. So I'm going to let their teacher take a minute to introduce himself and his students.
Hello, everyone. I'm Kelvin Ogba-Dafiago, the founder of the Ogba Educational Clinic here in Warri, Nigeria. And these are some of my students. We are very happy to be associated with this wonderful team that is helping to solve problems. The OEC is a STEM promoter, and our goal is to prepare Africans for the kind of change artificial intelligence is bringing into the fourth industrial revolution. Knowing fully well that Africa lost out in the first, second, and third industrial revolution, and the fourth industrial revolution is powered by artificial intelligence. So we are very excited. We want to learn about space technology. We want to learn about what is happening globally, how Africa can solve these pandemic problems, and how we can get out of it safely. So these are my students we hope to use to train others in Africa and prepare them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kelvin. Go ahead, Bob. Did you have something to say?
I just wanted to thank you as well. Kelvin, I encourage you and your students to check out. Tomorrow I have the executive board meeting of a group called the Planetary Society. We are led by Bill Nye, the science guy. Our co-founder was Carl Sagan some 40 years ago. It is the world's leading space advocacy organization. And I encourage you to check it out on the internet at www.planetary.org. I'm very proud to be on their executive board. I sit around a table with some amazing minds, but we are a tremendous resource to find out so your students can see exactly what our current status of space exploration is. And you can also become an advocate, and your student's voice can be part of where we go in the future in space, because we are, as members, we write petitions, we influence the leaders of our respective governments to show them how important it is to us, our future in space. So I encourage you to check it out. I thank you for your interest. It's a pleasure to meet all of you, and you honor me and my colleagues on Star Trek to say that we have helped inspire you in your very real goals in the real world. So thank you very much for what you said. I want to say one further thing, and that's what this conference is really about. Star Trek envisions a future where technology and science enable and empower, but don't destroy mankind. So much of science fiction is apocalyptic, post-nuclear disaster, whatever. Star Trek is a very positive vision, and it tells us that if we trust in science, it can get us out of very difficult situations, as we saw in the Star Trek episode Macrocosm, and as we're experiencing now in this terrible COVID-19 pandemic. Put our faith in science, and it will lead us out of this. If we all fellow crew members on planet Earth all get vaccinated, and we have wonderful news today about the intellectual property rights issues being set aside, so that these very important vaccines can spread easily throughout the populations across the globe. And we can all work together and put this behind us.
Thank you.
Bob, thank you. Kelvin and the school there in Nigeria, thank you for being here. We are so proud to have you. I do just want to ask our team to put in the chat the Planetary Society's address so that everyone can go and check it out. I am a proud member of the Planetary Society. Bob, will see you around the block. And with that, I think it's a great opportunity for us to hand it over to the experts and get started with the COVID talk. So Dr. Paul Pottinger, please take it away. We'll get your slides going. And if you need something, we're right here for you.
All right. You should have my audio and my video. Are you reading me okay, Captain?
You sound great.
Thank you guys so much. Thanks, Captain, for your words. Bob, Doctor, thank you for your inspiring work. Really, really impressive. I'm just so moved and so honored to be connected to all of you today across the entire world. Really, really exciting. What we wanted to do today on behalf of Barbara, Gary, and myself is just give a quick update of where we think we are with the science of COVID-19, and there should be time for plenty of discussion as well. I think what we heard from the captain is exactly right. You need to understand your source and who are you talking to. So we're often asked whether we have conflicts of interest, financial conflicts of interest. Quick answer is that I have many conflicting interests. I'm interested in taking great care of the patients in our hospital. I'm interested in training the next generation of infectious diseases physicians. You can see how seriously they take themselves. I'm interested in climbing tall mountains. I'm even interested in spending time with my very beautiful and happy family. No financial conflicts of interest. It's infectious disease. There's no money. Maybe that's the whole point. We were asked to talk about epidemiology. Epidemiology means where is the infection happening? Epi means upon, demi means people. So the study of what happens upon people. And where are we? Well, where we are as a species, Homo sapiens, humans on planet Earth. This is the best information that we have. I do like this particular resource. It is free and open source, and it is the most accurate single clearinghouse of data that I know. It's run by Johns Hopkins, and I'm going to include all of the links for your subsequent review in the bottom right corner of all of these slides. And you can do a web search and find this. So as of a couple of days ago when I updated this, the numbers are staggering and indeed inconceivable that we have 153 million cases and more than 3 million people who have died. In the map you see here, each red spot is a place where someone has been infected with COVID-19, and the size of that spot corresponds to the number of people in that location by their address. It is a flawed data set. I think if you look at the subcontinent of Africa, for example, our friends in Nigeria, I'm so happy to be connected to you. All of us, including the medical scientists in Nigeria, have concern and skepticism that the surveillance process in all of these parts of the world may be inaccurate. I'm deeply convinced and very alarmed that we may be undercounting and doing too little testing in certain parts of the world. And that's an opportunity for us to do better. But at least at the bare minimum, these are the numbers that we see. And in fact, if we look at different regions of the world over time, here in the horizontal axis is time, the vertical axis, the number of cases on a daily basis, going back weekly basis, going back for the last year, since the beginning. Each different region by the World Health Organization is in a different band of color. I would draw your attention to the far right of the screen and that purple band. That's for Southeast Asia. And you can see this exponential, substantial rise in those numbers. That's the Indian subcontinent, which is by far what's driving that particular increase. The numbers that I'm showing you are huge, indeed so big that, for me at least, the human mind cannot conceive of them. I would emphasize that each one of those numbers is a human life, and that for each death, we are a species diminished. It's the loss of an individual. It is a family that is destroyed. In the case of India, where people are cremated often on open wood fires, where the trees grew that became that firewood, there will be an empty space in the forest as a memorial to those lives that are lost. As a physician, I feel every one of those losses very directly. I happen to live and work in the United States of America. This is a map of our country. And if we zoom in, we can see that, well, it's not necessarily an equal opportunity infection. COVID-19 is an infection of human beings. Although it came originally from animals, it is now a human problem. So the map that you see before you, it's a map of where we live. The larger the circle, the more infections there are. And this tracks very clearly with where human beings live in our country. If there's more people in any given state, regardless of whether it voted red or blue, regardless of age, this is where we are seeing the infection. But it is not an equal opportunity pathogen. What we can see here in the United States is that as we have been able to step up as a people, as a society, we have been able to do a good job of keeping it under control in some cases. We have failed in other cases. So over time, these waves of infection follow political unrest, societal disgruntlement, and exhaustion within our society. I am actually uplifted by the idea that that number, the red line that you see, that's our weekly average. It is now again heading down, and I'm so heartened by that. In summary, COVID-19 in my country, the case fatality ratio is 1.8%. That means that if you are infected, there's roughly a 1 in 50 chance that you will die of the infection, at least statistically overall, and we'll get into that in a moment. In the United States, we comprise about 4% of all humans on our planet, and yet almost 1 in 5 infections has happened in my country. Here in the United States, this is the third leading cause of death after cardiovascular disease and cerebrovascular and cancer. So this is a huge increased burden of mortality in our country, and I think that that's true in so many parts of the world today. In my country, it does not infect people equally. It does tend to infect people who are more challenged with respect to their status in society. And in my country, if people self-identify as being Hispanic or Latinx or Native American or Black, they are dramatically more likely to be infected than if they are part of the so-called Caucasian or white community. This is not an equal opportunity pathogen. This is a reflection of the problems and challenges we have in our society. It's a referendum on who we are, and it's an opportunity for us to do better on this and so many other ways within our society. The good news is that we have a solution. The pathway forward is at hand, and that's through immunization or vaccines. So we wanted to talk briefly about vaccines. The vaccines that we currently have today in the United States are similar to vaccines elsewhere in the world. They're designed to train the immune system to recognize and destroy the spike protein. This is a diagram of the coronavirus. We call it corona because corona is Latin for a crown or a halo, and it does have that crown of spikes. Those spike proteins on the surface of this microscopic organism are critical because it's through the spike that this organism will be inhaled into our nose or our mouth, and on occasion our eyes, and then stick to our respiratory tree. Our respiratory tree expresses certain proteins. There's one called ACE2, the angiotensin converting enzyme 2. It's just something that we all have. It's a healthy part of our body, and this virus will stick to it through the spike. And once it does that, it will invade that respiratory lining, take over the machinery of our bodies, and do one thing and one thing only, make more of itself. Along comes the immune system to fight it off. And as I said, about 98% of the time that works. And about 2% of the time it fails. So scientists have recognized the critical role of spike, and that's where our vaccines go. In the United States, we currently have 2 different families of vaccines that are available here. One family is the mRNA vaccine, and one is a DNA vaccine. So mRNA vaccines, one happens to be made by Pfizer, one happens to be made by Johnson & Johnson. And the way they work is that they take the RNA, that's the ribonucleic acids, that's the molecular blueprint for the spike. And the scientists who've been working on this have realized that if they can take that RNA and put it into a shroud, a microscopic particle, that particle can then be put into the human body through a needle in the shoulder usually. And then the surveillance system of the shoulder, these are called dendritic cells. It's our immune surveillance system. It instantly recognizes this, takes it up, and starts to become a factory to make that spike protein. The vaccine doesn't do anything. The information in the vaccine uses your cells to make spike. This is brilliant because once the spike is made, it can be broken down, digested, presented to other cells. We can build an immune response over time in a way that is very safe, and except for a bit of a sore shoulder and maybe some aches and pains, very safe, very easily tolerated, and as I'll show you in a moment, very, very effective. We also in the United States have this family of vaccine called DNA vaccine, and this is being used by other vaccines elsewhere in the world, including AstraZeneca and others. It's not RNA, it's DNA. It's not in a microparticle, it's in a harmless virus. That virus does the same purpose, to get into the dendritic cells of the shoulder, to be turned into RNA. And once that RNA is made, of course, we get more spike, and we're off to the races. More spike is made, more antigens are presented. An antigen is just anything that generates an antibody response. An antibody is what's made in your body. That's the molecule that attacks those invading cells. So both RNA and DNA technology is here. It's exciting. And they work very, very well. We thought we'd take a moment to talk about just how well they do work, because there's some confusion about this. You'll see these terms used in the lay press and scientific literature. They're often used wrong, but technically speaking, the efficacy of a vaccine is how well it works in a trial when we test it, and the effectiveness is how well it works in real life after it's been tested and safe and we start giving it to people. So you'll hear a lot about this, that a particular vaccine, for example, our mRNA vaccines in the United States, are 95% efficacious. By itself, that doesn't tell you what they're really talking about. You want to know what the measurement is. Are we talking about being sick, being very sick, going to the hospital? Are we talking about life or death? What do we really mean when we say 95% efficacious? I'll give you some examples. These are the numbers from the Pfizer vaccine clinical trial. These are the very real numbers. These are not made up. And my friend John Cho, one of our faculty members at UW, tabulated these for me. I think they're very good. So in the registry trials for these vaccines, for example, out of 18,000 recipients of the vaccine, 8 ended up getting symptomatic COVID, fever, aches, pains. They felt sick. Whereas out of the same number, 18,000 other patients who got only placebo, this is a harmless saline shot, which wouldn't expect to be effective, 162 of them got symptoms. And that's where you get your number, because 8 out of 162 is 5%. Now, what that really means, though, is not that 5% of people who got the vaccine got COVID. Is that if you were to get sick, you were 95% more likely to do so if you did not get that vaccine and you were exposed. So here in this particular case, if you look at 162 out of 18,000 people who were exposed to COVID, in this particular group or cohort of people, yeah, they were about 1% risk of getting COVID-19. That's important background baseline risk factor. And the people who got vaccinated, on the other hand, they weren't 1%, they were 0.05% of that particular group that got infected. I would also emphasize that none of the people who got immunized were severely sick. None of them went to the hospital, and none of them died. So those are all important measurements as well, not just for public health, but for individual compassionate saving of lives. That's what we saw there. Now, the background risk really matters, right? Because what if the risk for infection was not 1%, but much higher, at 10%, people behaving in a way that maybe subsequently they wish they hadn't done and doing high risk behaviors? Well, you're still 95% protected, but the absolute risk would of course be 10-fold higher. That's what these numbers are here to say. I would emphasize that these vaccines were built before the new variants, or what I like to call the new mutants. And those new mutants you'll read a lot about. It's probably the wrong word to use. Most of the COVID-19 on planet Earth, certainly in my country, the United States, most of it is a variant. What are the variants? They come in crazy names, which are hard to remember, and I don't expect or want you to think about this. What I would say is that this is Darwinian evolution over time. It's exactly what science has told us would happen, that as we put a population under a certain stress, for example, the selective stress of whether it's able to infect a human being, those that are most fit will be naturally selected. The variants are more infectious than the original kind that came to our country from overseas and came elsewhere from overseas too. And that's absolutely what you would expect. The one that is more likely to infect someone is more likely to be spread. The more likely it is to be spread, the more likely it is to succeed. The variations that you will see, as I'll talk about in a moment, they relate to the spike. It's that spike protein, which in the case of the variants is more infectious. Why? A better fit as lock and key with the receptor in our lungs, that ACE2 receptor. So this is the actual structure of a COVID-19 molecule, what we call the severe acute respiratory virus syndrome coronavirus 2, but you can call it the COVID-19 virus, that's fine. And as you can see, that very tippity tip of the spike, that little white spot, that human receptor interface, that's that fitness that turns out to be better, a tighter lock and key in the variants than it was with what we originally had. And that's no surprise. The good news is that these viruses are probably not more deadly, and they are still very much susceptible to the protection we would get with most of the vaccines that we have nationally and internationally. There have been a few exceptions, especially in South Africa, where certain vaccines are less protective against the so-called South African variant. That is exceptional. And at least here in my country, the variants that we see are indeed protected by the vaccines that we have. And we know that's true because of you. because of the general public that has been willing to engage with science through this program. It's called vSafe. Everyone here on the call today, I would strongly encourage you to do so. This is a free process. After you get your vaccine, you sign up for vSafe. You get a secure account, and then it's a smartphone app, and you basically get a ping once a day from CDC. And it's a very simple process, takes less than 30 seconds. And they ask how you're doing. Do you have fever? Do you have a sore arm? Do you have any symptoms? And you share that information with CDC. It's voluntary, but if you're sick, they may follow up with other questions. This is a critically important step, and it's a part of technology that we've never used before. Why is it so important? It has allowed us to more rapidly identify the safety profile of these vaccines. For example, people who are pregnant were not included in the original trials for a variety of paternalistic and well-intended but paternalistic reasons. Thanks to vSafe, a lot of pregnant women chose to get immunized, and we've been able to track them and prove that they are healthy, that they've had good pregnancies, that indeed they are well protected this way. So I strongly encourage you to do so. I'm going to conclude my section before I hand off to Dr. Preston to say, the new vaccines are here. Please get your vax on, share that experience that you have with vSafe, and share your experience with your friends. This community where we are today, families, friends, spiritual communities. If you've had your immunization, talk to people about it. Tell them about that weight. For me, it felt like 30 pounds off my shoulders. I got more spring in my step. I have felt so happy that I knew that I was not going to die of this infection. Talk with your people about that. And in addition to all of that, please keep doing all the other things you need to do to keep yourself safe that Dr. Preston's going to go through, because until we're all immunized, we do still need to cover our face and monitor our own personal space. If you do this, you will live long, you will prosper. And so I'm very grateful for your kind attention. Let me hand over now, please, to Gary Preston.
Thanks, Paul. And thank you all for your invitation to share thoughts about our coronavirus situation and how we're going to get from where we are to where we need to be. For starters, we can't plot a course to our destination unless we know where we are. That is, we can't manage individual risk, which determines population risk, unless we know what contributes to risk and are able to effectively communicate about risk. So having reviewed the facts that Paul has so comprehensively presented, what perspectives will allow us to effectively process new information and together effectively act? In the next summary, you'll see that our management of individual risk that is in sync with others, indeed our societal response, requires that we share an understanding of components of risk and in fact, the infectious disease community has lacked a vocabulary to effectively describe mechanisms of transmission, even amongst ourselves. How can we manage individual risk, let alone cooperate with others, without some shared understanding and vocabulary? Another example besides, well, what is airborne? Travel in the next step is not all the same. It's one thing to go to Miami for spring break, and another to pile all those who've lived together in a vehicle and travel to the desert. The barriers to shared understanding have real consequences to our ability to coordinate our response. Guidelines or instructions without a rationale leads to assumptions regarding that rationale and ultimately controversy in the application of the guidelines, even amongst reasonable people who otherwise would agree. And a good example is the initial discussion and subsequent change in masking, recommendations regarding masking. Imprecise language compromises our ability of the most well-intentioned to apply guidelines to their lives. What is airborne? How are we to manage travel? And guidelines based on data and limited to the data are useful, are helpful, but as they're generated, it is very important that those who generate them consider the context in which they'll be applied. So publishing a guideline that says that all those who are immunized can gather without mentioning the fact that many of those who will be literally dying to gather have to deal with kids. And how are we going to manage the families that wish to gather in the context of altered, updated guidelines, but which are not directly applicable to many of the situations where they must be applied. Our processing of this information is helped by some structure to define the relationships between components of exposure and risk on the left of this little equation and outcome on the right. Understanding of these relationships is essential to our evaluation of interventions. In a daycare, an operating room, around a food cart, in an intensive care unit. The dynamics and the interactions are the same. And if we can understand these relationships, we then can incorporate new information into our consideration of how this risk may be modified. We're born into this or any other planet and begin to accumulate microorganisms. Some of these organisms we encounter as brief transients. Some move in, set up housekeeping, and are present indefinitely, referred to as colonization in this, on the right side of this little illustration. These micro communities are now referred to as our microbiome. They interact with each other, our immune system, our nutrition, and a list of other physiologic functions that are nowhere near completely understood. Some of these organisms can go on to cause physiologic disruption and disease, which we commonly refer to as infection. In fact, a third of us are colonized with Staphylococcus aureus, the most common cause of skin and wound infection. It's the most common cause of skin and wound infection because it's so common. It's available to fall into a wound, be aspirated to the lower respiratory tract from the upper respiratory tract, where it may happily survive with no untoward consequence at all, until the relationships on the left are altered, at which time it may go on to cause infection. When we put the facts of Paul's review of coronavirus into this framework, we can see how these dynamics interact. For example, is transmissibility enhanced by increased resistance to environmental stresses such as desiccation or UV light? Is binding to host cell surfaces enhanced, which would decrease the number of virus particles necessary to achieve infection? Is the viral surface to which protective antibodies bind altered by mutations in these variation or mutants altered such that binding is no longer efficient and antibody from natural infection or immunization is no longer protective? How effective is distancing in reducing the dose of virus that might be encountered? You may have heard that the solution to pollution is dilution. Well, it's not the solution. Elimination or containment at the source would be, but dilution is a function of distance, air currents, and UV inactivation that can reduce the dose of virus delivered to a potential host. It's worth noting that the lack of precise language to describe airborne transmission is evident even in CDC's infection precaution guidelines for healthcare. HIV/AIDS drove adoption of precautions based on mechanisms of transmission, given that blood, other body substances, including snot, and moist body surfaces are common sources of infectious organisms. Use of personal protective equipment such as gloves, gowns, face shields during patient care are now the norm in healthcare. And the strategy is referred to as standard precautions. Interesting question is, how will those standards change as we incorporate this, the information we now have about coronavirus? And indeed, look at what's happened to influenza. We can't find any. And to what degree is that a consequence of the changes we've made in order to try to minimize transmission of coronavirus? When organisms transmitted by specific routes are identified, precautions designed to interrupt transmission by those routes are used. Transmission by direct contact, contact precautions consisting of gowns and gloves. Transmission by large droplets that fall 1 to 2 meters from the source, droplet precautions consisting of masks and face protection, such as would be needed for managing pertussis, or the organism that would be transmitted in those large droplets, Bordetella pertussis. Transmission long distances by remnants of evaporated droplets and air currents requires the use of what has been called airborne precautions, calling for controlled airflow and respirators, such as would be the case or needed for management of measles, varicella, or chickenpox. But wait, what about partially evaporated droplets that form aerosols? We have inconsistent language and a fragmented strategy. And this table from a paper published in the Journal of Hospital Infection last month gives gives some nice insight into whose language describes what. As I've mentioned, we have strategies that are well thought out to deal with droplets and airborne transmission, but aerosol, not so much. We made a stab at it with H1N1 and are trying again with coronavirus, and I'm hoping that CDC will develop some language and methodology. You'll notice that clinicians have defined strategies to manage droplet and airborne transmission, but aerosols, not so much or for so long. Another example of how this imprecision has resulted in controversy in the literature is from this paper published in Emerging Infectious Disease last year, describing the exposures that occurred in Guangzhou, China, in a restaurant. The current air currents shown in figure A appear to have resulted in transmission to persons seated at tables B and C. The article and subsequent letters to the editor have demonstrated awkwardness when precision of language is insufficient. What was airborne transmission and what isn't? On a more positive note, these publications also demonstrate how published debate tests hypotheses and contributes to our understanding of biological dynamics and our ability to describe them. The need for clear articulation of how and why in order to guide intervention was illustrated by the consideration of use of masks as intervention to prevent COVID transmission. Initially, the no need to mask in public message was driven by the notions that the mask was intended to protect the wearer, which they don't do well. Prevalence of the virus was low, was perceived as low, and those infected would likely be symptomatic. A change in recommendation to encourage masking was the result of a realization that symptoms may not be present, prevalence was high, and the fact that masks are known to contain infectious agents at the source quite well. In fact, masking tuberculosis patients has been very effective, and it would require airborne precautions to protect those potentially exposed, but containment at the source can be very simply managed quite effectively. Same intervention, different rationale. And the rationale, without clear explanation, leads to the conclusion or the question of how these sources of conflicting recommendations can possibly be believed. So providing the rationale as part of the explanation is critical. How can we use these notions to manage risk in real life, despite the need to interact with others who may have different concepts and language to manage risk? Risk is never zero. And I happily plagiarize a concept from a Hopkins epidemiologist who I hope to be able to name at some point when I find her name, who mentioned the notion or discussed the notion of managing your risk budget and managing that budget wisely. The practicality of managing families and relationships is stressful, even when one presumes to have the knowledge. We need to manage our risk budgets wisely. Define your pod and those with whom you share minimized exposures. Adopt masking, distancing, and immunization expectations. Establish manageable but safe routines outside the pod. For shopping, for example, minimizing, masking, and so forth. Expand contacts intentionally with people, pods who share your definitions and expectations. Everyone will be immunized. And how are we going to deal with the kids? Do not vary without consultation, even if the variance seems reasonable and consistent with shared philosophy. If a variance occurs, consult with the pod you're connecting with at the next planned contact or before the next planned contact, rather than after the fact, after which the other pod members would consider themselves to be exposed. Consider the risk versus benefit of each variance from standard practice and reserve variances for the highest value contacts. If there's going to be a wedding in the family, a gathering that decides on strategy regarding the venue, the distancing, the masking, the immunization expectations is important. Traveling, as I mentioned, is not traveling. A pod in the van again to the woods is not the same as spring break in Cancun. And guidelines that attempt to cover all under the term travel often lead to controversy and needless conflict. One of the important sources of debate and conflict has to do with information sources. For starters, no information source is conspiracy theory proof. Define the most credible source you can, and you will find a conspiracy that debunks its value. Sources of credible guidelines will be referenced to published literature. When CDC or WHO or Hopkins or others publish guidelines, they publish the list of papers. Sometimes the CDC, the references that CDC includes in their documentation of guidelines goes into the hundreds with each publication. Social media anecdotes, hearsay may be received politely, but should not be shared without source checking. See number 2 above. Even published findings can ultimately be found to be false. Confirmation by multiple researchers contributes to credibility, but they will not be conspiracy theory proof. In emerging infectious disease article I mentioned regarding the outbreak associated with the Gansu restaurant is an example where debate led in letters to the editor led to clarification. Additional analyses of transmission in various settings are helping to define parameters affecting transmission and will provide perspective that will drive development of more precise language and more widespread understanding. This understanding will only be useful if we can act on it together. And in fact, future Casperia Con sessions will provide important tools to guide that action. I refer you to the sessions entitled The Prime Detective, Responsibility, Love and Leadership, Individuality, Captain Controversies. I hope these thoughts have been useful. Now I return control to the bridge. Thank you.
We were
Thank
just
you
gonna.
very much, doctors. Paul, go ahead. I didn't mean to step on you.
Yeah, sorry,
No,
I meant
it's
to toss you back to Paul for concluding remark.
We wanted to finish with this analogy, which we hope will be instructive for you and your families. A long time ago, a very talented psychologist called Dr. Rorschach had a problem. He wanted to know what people were concerned about, their hopes, dreams, and fears. But he did not want to lead the witness. He wanted them to speak spontaneously and from their heart and from their soul. But he didn't know how to do that without asking questions. Very brilliantly, he came up with the idea of a neutral prompt. He squirted some ink on a paper, folded it in half, and then opened it up. It's called an ink blot. And it became a test that's now known as the Rorschach test. And it was a way for people to be studied and also to talk about what was really bothering them. And I would suggest to you simply that that is indeed exactly what COVID-19 is. This is our modern Rorschach. And that every time that we doom scroll online, prepare our children for school, go to the grocery store, choose to get our vaccine, choose to mask up, it is simply there asking us what we want in our lives and in our society. It's an infectious disease. It is a virus. It's a very real thing. You don't get it from 5G. There are no microchips involved, but it could be. Frankly, I have come to believe that COVID-19 is a human behavioral problem, and that is good news because it's also a human behavioral opportunity. There is no one who will save us but us. And I think that's an important way for us to frame this, that although we are in terrible trouble because we have made a whole bunch of terrible decisions, we also have an amazing opportunity to elevate our game as a species, to take care of ourselves in the way Dr. Preston says. And when we do that, we take care of each other. So yeah, we are very grateful for your time. I'll stop my share. And Captain, I think we do have time also for questions or discussion, whatever you would advise.
Thank you both very much. I appreciate your insights and your wisdom. And I think everybody here listened with bated breath to what you had to say. I did, and I'll speak for everybody because I'm the captain. Well, okay. Bob, I would like to give you an opportunity to ask whatever's on your mind about COVID or whatever else you might like to ask these two doctors.
Thank you. Right. First of all, you're both doctors, Paul and Gary, are wonderful communicators. I found this very informative. Much of it, some of it I've heard before. I was surprised early on in the pandemic because I didn't understand that the dose of virus that people receive seems to be directly related to the to how bad their conditions got. So if you could speak a little bit more of that, have there been tests has there been data collected about an actual measuring the dose of virus that someone received and how sick they got, and whether, for example, I know that underlying conditions are very important, but if you got a huge a dose of the virus and are otherwise a healthy individual, is there a direct relationship with how sick you became?
Yeah, Bob, thank you so much. I'm curious for Gary's perspective too. For me as a medical doctor, it's one of the many things that blew my mind. When I went into this pandemic, I did not think that was a thing. It was like a light switch, yes or no, on or off, infected or not. It has become clear through a variety of different levels of evidence that exactly what you said does indeed seem to be true. Little COVID, you'll probably be okay. A lot of COVID, higher risk for bad outcomes. This is hard for us to study in a human model. We don't have a lot of volunteers signing up to do dose responses. But the reason we think this is true is because of the mask. Probably the best evidence that we have is for masking. That if we take patients who are infected and we ask them about their masking habits, understand how well and how often, how diligently, carefully that they mask, patients who mask are less likely to get sick. And if they get sick, it is more likely to be less bad. If we control for underlying factors, as you brilliantly said, some people are going to have a bad go because their immune system is reduced. But I think what you said is true. And this is one of the main things, as Gary pointed out so beautifully, when we started in the pandemic, we said, mask up to protect others, but it won't protect you. This is not correct. And we have had to say, science is what it is. It doesn't care what we think. I call this the honey badger virus. It just doesn't care what we want, right? It simply is. And if we follow it with good scientific technique, we've learned so much. Gary, does that sound right to you as well?
Yes, sir. And I think that it's when you think about the dose and the timing, that is the response to that dose has to be the mounting of the immune response, and dose will count. In that the greater the dose, the greater the likelihood that the defending troops cannot marshal fast enough and comprehensively enough to ward off the intruders. So it is almost intuitive that some of these dynamics will interact as we've now seen, and it applying these principles to new information, as Paul's described, helps us keep this in the new information in context.
I want to butt in here and just tag along to what Gary was saying. I like to talk about norovirus when we have this discussion and are giving an orientation at a new hospital or something like that. I often like to say that norovirus only needs 18 viral particles to infect you, and 18 is a really small number. So if we're looking at that versus we have a range for HIV, which is between 1 and 65,000 to infect you. And we don't know, because I don't think it's terribly ethical to infect someone with HIV and then count how many it took to get the job done. So the point is, tiny small number for norovirus. By the way, everybody, norovirus is that lovely bug that you get from the salad bar or the buffet or the potluck that gives you nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea for a couple of days. Most people survive. The point is that the amount of it is actually crucial. If you get 16 viral particles of norovirus, maybe you won't get it. If you get 18 or 19 or above, guess what? So it really does matter how much gets in you. All right. Thank you for that lovely answer. I wonder if, can the two of you just talk a little bit about everyday masking, just the practicality of when should you, when do you maybe not need to, do you need to take a shower after you went for a walk? The very basics, practical, what do you need to do in everyday life?
Well, I'll start, and Paul, clean up, please. Again, the mask, I think of the mask as being most effective for containment. And if that, and one of the reasons that masking has been de-emphasized for the immunized is because the source is then controlled, unless there's a breakthrough infection, and masking not so important. But the problem is we don't know who's been immunized, who hasn't, and we're trying to manage this all together with some consistent message. So as a practical matter, unless the interaction is with a controlled group of folks who've all agreed that and represent that they've been immunized, masking, even if immunized, helps support the notion that masking is important, quite frankly. And there are many who are not immunized, and in fact, may not be. So it used to be, and managing the contacts and exposures clearly must focus on the aerosols that may be involved. Routine sanitation seems to otherwise be quite sufficient. Take it away.
I mean, I agree with all that. And the practical advice I give my patients and their families is that do not mask up in your own home unless you're caring for someone in the basement who happens to have COVID. So if you're in your house, you're good to go. If you're with your bubble of people, and as you said very brilliantly, they're all following the rules and you believe that to be true, then they can't be infected either, especially if they're all immunized. And when I say immunized, I mean it's been at least 2 weeks since the last dose of whatever series you get. So if you're immunized, you don't need to mask up. If you're with other people who are immunized, as long as it's not a whole lot of those people, CDC doesn't tell us what a whole lot is, but more than a few sounds right. If you're outside, not necessary to mask unless you're all sitting together, masks off, eating and drinking, yucking it up, drinking alcohol, that's a higher risk situation. But going for a walk, riding a bike, going for a run outdoors, masking is not required, especially if you're immunized. But even for those who are not yet fully immunized, that would be relatively safer. Any other time when I'm out in public, when I'm indoors and it's not my own home, I have a mask on. And as an infectious disease physician, I was immunized relatively early when that back in December of 2020. So I still think that's a really important thing. How do we get out of this? Everybody gets immunized. Once everybody's immunized, then that need for masking really will go away.
Thank you. I really want to make sure that we get into the audience Q&A right now. So I am going to toss it over to Commander Gary Cannon to start calling on people to ask questions. What we're going to do is he's going to read your name and select questions out of the Q&A button. If you have a question, please enter it into the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You may have to roll your mouse or your finger over the bottom of your view screen to see that Q&A. Type your question there, and then we will call on you and have it answered. All right, go for it.
I should say we have quite a few questions, quite a lot, well more than we could answer in the remaining time. So if
Fair
we
enough.
do add more questions, we probably won't get to it, and we probably won't get to all those that have been asked, even if I've clicked on the answer live button. For our first question comes from Masood Varjavandi. Masood.
There's a nice question from Masood. I can read it. He's typed it in here regarding Switzerland, perhaps, who did not quarantine, was hoping to get to mass immunity. How did it go? I can't answer the question about Switzerland in particular. What we have seen time and again, both within the United States communities and elsewhere in the world, is that when people have chosen not to quarantine and not to immunize, eventually we've seen outbreaks. So that rate of how often it happens is what Gary said. How often are people coming into that community bringing in the virus? That could be a ski resort town in the American West. It could be a mountain community with deep valleys, very little commerce between other societies. So ultimately, the pathway forward for them will be a path of pain, suffering, and loss, unfortunately. And I'm hoping that there have been many exceptions to this. But generally speaking, herd immunity, meaning waiting for everybody to get infected so that they can't get infected again, that turns out to be something that we have paid the price for, at least within our own country here in the United States. So I appreciate that question a lot.
All right. Who's next?
Next, another one of Kelvin's students, Akpevwe, has a question. And if they're not ready, then maybe we'll go on to number 3 and circle back. Number 3 was a kind of 2-part question from an anonymous questioner, so I can rephrase that to ask it. One is, are we likely to need another vaccine, a booster, at the end of the year or at another time? And second, what do you recommend for persons who have never received any vaccine due to allergic reactions?
I mean, Gary, I think you'll agree. We very strongly predict that there will be a fall or winter time immunization. That's our traditional flu immunization season. I strongly predict that we will be immunized this year for flu and COVID. Whether it's the same COVID vaccine as before or not, we don't know. Will it be one shot for both flu and COVID? I don't know the answer to that either. I think there's great benefit in trying to get a seasonal booster. I think that's true.
Yeah, yes, and it's worth noting that coronavirus is an RNA virus. Influenza is an RNA virus. What do RNA viruses do? They mutate frequently. And the more virus that's around, this gets to another question that I saw, I believe, in the chat. And the more viruses that's circulating, the more chances for mutation, the more chances for natural selection amongst us, and the greater the likelihood that the virus will refine its capabilities to improve its ability to infect. That's what natural selection is all about. And the huge numbers amount of virus that's circulating allows or facilitates the selection of the most competent viri and ensures that its ability to infect will improve. So as with influenza, it wouldn't be surprising at all that we end up with a situation where, due to the shifts and drifts of the viral genome, we'll have to refresh our immunity occasionally.
The other part to that question was what to do about people who have had allergic reactions to previous vaccines. We take this very seriously. The vaccines that are currently available here in the United States are quite different in their composition from other vaccines that are out there. They are based in part on other chemicals. For example, some of the chemicals that are in laxatives or other cosmetic products. If you have had an allergic reaction to any injectable medication, you need to speak with a physician or healthcare provider about this. In some cases, we would do a scratch test, an allergy test. That's exceptional. Almost always we can safely give these immunizations and then watch someone for a full half an hour after they get their shot. There are exceptions, and some people have had very severe, life-threatening IgE-mediated anaphylactic reactions, difficulty breathing. We absolutely need to have you assessed first, either by your own physician or by a licensed allergist before you get immunized. First, we do no harm. And I think that's important for immunizations as it is for everything we do in medical practice.
I seem to remember Voyager's doctor saying that a couple of times, we do no harm. Kelvin, your student Akpevwe has a question.
Hi.
I want to ask Bob, is there any similarity between the COVID-19 and the virus in Voyager?
Is there a relationship between the COVID-19 virus and?
The virus in Star Trek.
Oh, the virus in Star Trek. Well, let's put it this way. I think it obeys some of the same principles of transmission in the episode. I cannot. We have experts here can answer that more accurately. Star Trek is always based in real science. We do get some things wrong. I caught the writers a number of times with my simple 2 years of pre-med background. There were times when I was given things to say when I had to call the writers and say, I'm sorry, this is not correct. I can't say the first cells to be attacked by the Borg nanoprobes are the patient's blood cells, because blood is a tissue. So I should really say the first tissue to be attacked by the nanoprobes is the patient's blood. And he said, well, that doesn't sound right. And I said, well, I think it is. So what they would do is the production would shut down for 5 minutes when different people were called on the phone or whatever, or books were opened, and then it was understood that we could change the line. However, my understanding is not deep enough to answer your question fully, but I would like to share really briefly a little personal reflection, especially for people who have vaccine hesitancy. My grandfather died in the last pandemic in 1918. And I'm sure had there been a vaccine, I like to think that because he was a recent immigrant to America and that he wanted to stay alive and take care of his 4 children that he already had, that he would have taken that vaccine. But what I thought about recently is, had my grandfather, who died at age 32 in 1918, taken a vaccine for influenza, for that pandemic, and survived, had that all been possible, and lived another 50 years, then I would have known him for the first 15 years of my life. So if you make a decision not to be vaccinated, you are not only making a decision that affects all of your fellow crew members here on Spaceship Earth in the present, but you're making a decision about your own family in the future. Your decision will impact them, because the consequences of your decision may rob them of some experience that I certainly would love to have had with my own grandfather. Does that resonate at all? Does that make any kind of sense to people?
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now, I need to acknowledge that we are at the top of the hour, and that I believe Dr. Pottinger has a meeting. He is welcome to stay if he would like, but I would not be accused of encouraging him to miss his meeting. I believe I'm going to ask Dr. Preston if he's available. I am still available, and we will continue to answer questions at least for a few more minutes so that we can make sure that we have some time for that. But Paul, if you need to go, we understand.
Unfortunately, I do. It's not more important than this. It's just more pressing, but not more important, and certainly not more fun. So good to be connected to all of you. Please take this forth. Go forth, spread the gospel, exactly as Bob says. Your decisions have such ramifications for all the future generations. I'm very grateful, and I'm grateful to be connected with you now. And if we do this again, if the captain wants to launch the ship again, I'd be very honored to come back.
I have a feeling that that may happen. I've received some nudges in that direction.
Do it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Paul.
All right, so let's take another question.
Next question from Heather Cameron.
Hello, Heather. Can we get you on camera? I'm hoping there's your face. Welcome aboard. Please ask your question.
All right, I just have to pull it up because I can't remember what my question is now. Hi, I would like to know, what effect does COVID-19 have on people who suffer from endometriosis and conditions like it? And the second part of my question is, what effect does COVID-19 have on treatment for people with endometriosis? And yes, it's a personal question, and take it away.
I wish Paul had stayed on another 30 seconds. I don't know. And I've not heard any or read any consideration or seen any data relevant to that. I can say that it's clear that the immune response to the virus is highly variable, and these long-termers are going to require some pretty intense study. And there have been there's apparently alteration in in those folks following immunization. So the immunization appears to be impacting immunity in a way that alters the course of late consequences of infection. I don't think that's understood at all. So hold on. As more folks are immunized, and it's possible to study the patterns of the consequences of immunization in a wide range of folks and of various immune capabilities and characteristics. It's going to be interesting to see what genetic or other immunologic factors influence outcomes or that interact. I don't think it's clear yet.
Okay, thank you very much, by the way. The presentation was very well done.
Thank you.
Thank you, Heather, for that. And I just want to clarify that the infectious disease professionals you have left on the line are an infectious disease RN, I'm a nurse, and Gary Preston, who is a PhD epidemiologist. So we may not be able to answer certain kinds of questions that are outside our scopes of practice. However, I would like to attempt to get your questions answered for you. So what I will do is collect your questions and request that Paul or others in the infectious disease around us, our colleagues, answer them, and we will attempt to get those answers back to you. I can't make that promise, but I will make the attempt. So please make sure you put those in the Q&A so that we have them, and we'll do our best for you. Thank you. So who's next?
Yeah, I would just endorse the captain's approach here. As you saw in my presentation, I referred to literature that was published last month. And I don't know how everyone's reading habits map out, but it's very difficult to keep up with this literature. And when we gang up on these questions, it's quite likely that one of us will have recent information that may be relevant, or increases the chances that one of us will. And so that'll be a great strategy. Thank you, Barbara.
Absolutely. Who's next?
We have
Gary Cannon, Commander, you are on mute and we cannot hear a word you're saying.
Thank you very much for that kind information. Our next question comes from Valerie Jeksch, who I'm going to assume is German and just say is Jeksch because that just sounds delightful. Valerie has asked me to read her questions for her. One is, how do you respond to someone who says they've never gotten a flu shot before and also never had the flu, so why should they get a COVID shot? And their second question is, pertains to something that was mentioned in one of the talks specifically. The greater the dose in one exposure, is that worse than multiple small exposures? For example, an extreme might be if someone sneezes into your face or if you're eating in a crowded restaurant. Would one likely be worse than the other?
Those are two excellent questions. I want to start with the first one again, and I'm going to restate to make sure that I heard it and then frame it a little bit for discussion. It sounds like we have a question of what if someone has never gotten the flu shot and they say they've never gotten the flu, why should they then get a COVID vaccine? I want to have us think about that as a person who is concerned about getting sick and a person who is looking for knowledge and someone who is very much seeking understanding and cares very much for the health and well-being of their body. They may have one kind of information or another, but they are curious and I want to honor that. So Gary, do you want to take a stab at that? And then I can dive in as helpful.
Yeah, well, one aspect has to do with, you may think you've never had the flu, but the fact is there are what are referred to as subclinical infections where one develops a day of feeling punky, and in fact, their immune system managed to vanquish the invader, and they may not have had symptoms, but they had the flu. And in fact, they responded immunologically. This happens with chickenpox even, and other infectious agents. The response is not always great or none. The other facet of that is has to do with the person's willingness to assume risk, not just for themselves, but for others they care about who live with them or are around them. And they may not have had the flu yet, but if they were to get it, the consequences for others around them, particularly since they would be infectious before their symptoms became impressive enough to be recognized as the flu, they would present risks to those around them. And that becomes a matter of conscience. So I think there are a number of, it's difficult to counter some of these reservations on the fly. But if we can find scripts or language that communicates the potential consequences in a concise and with as little judgment as possible, it'll enhance our communication, I hope.
And I think that's quite correct. Enhancing our communication about this, Gary, is exactly the way to go. And to that end, I think a direct answer about the consequences of if you don't get vaccinated, this is what could occur, is in order here, because I really like that person to have the information. So if you don't get vaccinated for influenza, you may, in fact, get influenza, not know it, and then pass it along to someone else. And you may pass it along to someone else that you never meet and never know about. I do want to just mention that influenza deaths happen. They are not all that infrequent, and they are of grave concern to people who are particularly vulnerable, the very old and the very young, and lots of folks in between. They've just been essentially invisible because it has been that, well, I'm just a little bit sick, I can go out in society. Well, a little bit sick is infectious most of the time. That's kind of how it is. If you are exhibiting symptoms, by and large, and of course, I'm not going to say always or never because that doesn't work, there is a risk that you will transmit the disease to someone else, whether you meant to or you realized it or not, and that person could have very serious consequences, including death. The same is true for COVID. If you choose not to get a vaccine, it is possible that you may contract COVID, never know it, pass it along to someone else, and that they could pay the ultimate price for it. That's simply what's the case. And that gives you an opportunity and the power to make a decision based on real information about what could actually happen. And we hope that it's helpful to be put in that direct manner for you.
Also, if you have any doubt that the mitigation factors, if you follow them carefully, actually work, I will share this with you. I am 67 years old, and I believe this is the first year of my life that I haven't gotten a common cold. Why?
Yes.
What an excellent point, Bob. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yes.
I can add to that. I usually get a cold about every other month. In fact, sometime the year prior to COVID, it was every month I caught a cold, and not a thing since in these 14 months. Now that I've said that, I should be sneezing this time tomorrow, but there it is.
And so it has been with influenza. Last influenza season in the Southern Hemisphere, influenza was way down, and in the Northern Hemisphere this last season, the same. The number of cases of influenza we've seen has been tiny compared to previous years.
Gary, there was a part two to that. Sorry, Commander Cannon, there was a part two to that question, and I've forgotten it. Would you please reiterate?
Certainly. The question was whether one dose of great exposure, like being sneezed upon, is worse than having multiple small exposures, like if you're eating in a crowded restaurant. And I'm assuming this would be the last question, given the time.
We can evaluate that. We might check in with Dan about how anxious he is to get to the party, and if we have one or two more good questions. Otherwise, as you say, Commander.
This really is bullet dodging.
Please keep the intelligent discussion happening. The party can always happen later. This is amazing. Keep going, and don't worry. Keep going.
Thank you. I appreciate the responsibility there. Go ahead, Gary. Preston.
Oh, I was going to say this is a lot like bullet dodging, if that large dose manages to overcome the immune defenders, that's one thing. What are the chances that'll happen? Well, you may manage to ward off that large dose. Then what about the individual smaller doses? Well, you may be able to contend with one small dose and a second small dose, and maybe those doses will enhance your immunity. Maybe they won't be large enough to trigger an immune response that's additive over repeated exposures, and it's exposure number 5 that does it. So it's difficult to say, since we rarely have the opportunity to make a decision about whether we're going to try to muscle through one large dose or suffer or sustain multiple small doses, it becomes a matter of trying to rationally minimize the number of doses total, regardless of size, that you might encounter. But minimizing the dose certainly makes intuitive sense. And as you saw in my little equation, is one that we can manage and attempt to avoid.
And to that point, Gary, about attempting to avoid, I want to talk about snot for a minute. What Bob was saying about having not gotten a cold and how the mitigation strategies are effective and what kinds of effects that those mitigation strategies have is golden. So when we're talking about COVID, well, okay, that's the current big bad in the room. But it's really worth pointing out that previously in the United States, it was acceptable, as I've mentioned earlier, to go to your friend's house for a party a little bit sick. Well, you're a little bit sick. Your snot, as it exits you, oh, sneeze posting returns just in time. Thank you, chat. This is exactly my point. Snot is something that we will benefit from controlling even after COVID is over or vaccinated, under control, whatever you'd like to call it, assuming we get to that point. And I don't make assumptions and I don't count microbes out or down for the count because microbes are incredibly persistent and efficient forms of they're just incredible. Let's just put it that way. Getting back to my point, controlling snot is something that we can take what we've learned from COVID and we can move it forward. So here in the US, we can develop a culture of, oh, well, I guess maybe I've got a cold. Well, if I throw on a mask before the thing I absolutely have to do that I can't avoid because I can't stay home, otherwise you would be staying home, there's a chance that we can keep the snot where it belongs, which is controlled at the source. I also want to say a word about source control in case that word is new to some of you. What we mean by source control is that we prevent the infection from leaving the place where it originated. Let's say that I am sick. I am the source. When I put on a mask and I then am controlling my snot output into the mask, I am source controlled. I hope that makes sense for everyone.
Well, except for one thing, Commander, I think we're supposed to say mucilaginous compound rather than snot. I believe
point is well taken, Bob. Mucilaginous compound. I apologize for my imprecise language. No, I don't. Snot's good.
And that begs the question, how will our standard approach to daily life change at all going forward? How can we harvest some practicalities out of our responses that will serve us well in the future? In the healthcare setting, HIV/AIDS changed the way we practice. The standard practice, the standard precautions that I mentioned came out of an era where dentists did not wear gloves. The dental pieces, hand pieces could not be sterilized. When I consider the laboratory procedures I was trained to perform in the pre-AIDS era, looking back now is frightening. And there were good nurses in those days who would say, as we attempted to change the culture, if I put gloves on as often as you tell me I should, my patients will think I consider them dirty. And the culture, they were good nurses, smart, wanted to do well by their patients. And it was a culture that needed to be changed. And it did. And in the pre-AIDS era, when the high school wrestling match opened a wound and there was blood on the mat, it was the red badge of courage. And 2 years later, there were grandmothers with bleach bottles out there suited up in a heartbeat, and things changed. The question will be now, how should our practices in and out of healthcare change to manage risk as we begin to understand it?
I would like to think that one such adjustment going forward that we could all make without any stigma whatsoever is that if you do feel, as the commander said, a little bit sick one day, and you do have to go out for something, that you will be able to wear a mask 2, 3, 5, 10 years from now in the future because of this lesson we've all learned. And there's no stigma to doing it. It's done, my understanding, in certain Asian cultures, just as in the same way that you cover your mouth when you cough, you wear a mask if you are not feeling 100%, and that you might have a bug of some kind. I think that would be great if our society here in America could be that concerned for the other, to take this lesson from COVID and use it going forward.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. When I trained in healthcare, if you could fog a mirror and be vertical, you were at work. And to not be at work was somehow, it was interpreted as much by the person who was ill as anyone else as some dereliction in duty. And in fact, in 2012, there was a pertussis whooping cough epidemic in the state of Washington. And one clinical scenario, there were 2 physicians in one hospital who probably infected each other. They diagnosed each other. They treated each other. They both continued to work. And we ended up having to call dozens of people in for prophylaxis after exposure. I'm sure their heads knew better, but it was going to be inconveniencing many people. Skipped a shift. And we need to make adjustments in order to accommodate those situations when they arise, so that we can accommodate them nimbly in all scenarios, as you've described, to change the culture.
And I think it does get back to what, Bob, you said about caring for each other. It just really stuck out at me, what you said. And it really comes down to that, is caring for each other. And one way we can demonstrate that is by wearing masks. And someone in the chat brilliantly said, yeah, I think I'll wear a mask on an airplane all the time. Great idea. Wearing masks on airplanes. Wow, what a fabulous plan. I think that's, yes. All right. Have we thoroughly answered that question, Gary Cannon, do you think?
I think so.
Excellent. Let's take another.
Okay, I should add too, the chat is indeed wild with the notion of wearing masks with I would say reckless abandon, but I guess it's the opposite of reckless in this case. Our next question comes from Trixie Beaker, who was with us until 2 seconds ago, disappeared from here.
Coming back in. Yep, she's here.
Oh, great. Okay, perfect.
Yeah, I'm informing people by typing that they're next, but it does just take time to promote them from one level to the
And that's why you're my first officer.
I'll get a face tattoo next week. No, I will not do that.
Hi, sorry.
Hold him to it.
I'm cooking dinner, so I'm just going to move to where you can actually see me a little bit. I can't remember my question. I typed it out in chat.
Would you like me to remind you, and then you can repeat after me, so you get the honor of asking the question yourself still?
Oh, well, how about I'll add any nuances if needed.
You had just typed, you've heard that the more people that are vaccinated, the few variants will develop. Is that true, and why?
Yes, the mutations occur randomly, and the more candidates for random mutation there are circulating, the greater the likelihood that mutations that will enhance the virus's capability of infecting or avoiding immunity goes up. When we're talking about billions and billions of viri, it turns out that the fewer there are circulating, the fewer there are to potentially mutate. So it will be, the question is whether we can get the numbers down sufficiently and isolate the foci of contagion sufficiently so that the opportunity for transmission is decreased. And if a mutant of great capability does emerge, it's isolated and doesn't go into wide circulation.
Yeah, so basically, one of the things that we have our eyeballs on are the world's hotspots. For example, India is one. The United States is another notable hotspot in various locations. The more cases, the more likely there is to be a variant of concern. So the more that we mind our P's and Q's, the more that we follow the guidance that's given, the more we wear our masks when we should, the faster we all get everybody vaccinated, the better off we are.
Thank you. Thank you for the rescue, Gary. Thank you for the helpful answer. And I just want to say, I really like the theme of how is it affecting the rest of society if you can get yourself vaccinated? And how does it affect not only now, but future generations? So I really appreciate you bringing those ideas out.
Absolutely. Thank you, Trixie.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Is that are those the births of lower decks?
Yes, they are.
Yes. Yeah, that's
okay.
If I were in Starfleet, this is where I would be, I'm sure.
What about you, Bob? Do you think you would be a denizen of lower deck? Do you think that would be something of interest to you? Just asking.
You speaking to me as not my character, but as the actor who played my character, having been the chief medical officer of the Starship Voyager, I don't know. I like to think. I don't want to pass judgment in any way. I'm simply not going to. I'm not going to answer the question. Okay. But I am going to, because laughter is still the best medicine, and not to undermine in the slightest the seriousness of our discussion, I'm going to tell you the only COVID joke I've heard in the last year that made me laugh. Here it is. And it's from a doctor, by the way. Before COVID, I used to cough to cover up my farts. Now I fart to cover up my coughs. Well, if you can talk about snot, I thought it was okay to mention, well, never mind.
Thank you, Bob.
Decorum with a small d.
Our next question, if I may bring it back, comes to us a pair of questions from Chile, from Sebastian Puentes Prieto.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, I'm looking. Well, my first question was about the infectivity rates here in Chile. As you know, here in Chile, we have we have advanced a lot in the vaccination efforts. About 6 million people are in their second dose, with 4 million more in their first one. However, our infectivity rates are not down. They are still up and they're still soaring. And even if we're talking about a country with a population of approximately 20 million people, half of them has at least the first vaccine, but we haven't seen any steady decrease in the infection rates, and even more in the severe cases that require, for example, respirators or being in the ICU. Why could that be happening? For what I understood from one of the presentations was that rolling out the vaccination effort should make those infectivity rates go down, right?
What an excellent question. Thank you.
Yes, and without an understanding of the prevalence of immunization amongst those who've become ill and the circulation patterns, the exposure patterns of those who are becoming ill, it's difficult to know how to explain what you're seeing. I can only say that here in the US, where we've seen a loosening of intention to mask, such as at sports events and other scenarios, we've had plenty of transmission and our incidence is up. In the state of Washington, that's certainly been true. We hope that immunization will begin, and we think it has begun to cut into that. But if behavior, which may be associated with vaccine avoidance, facilitates transmission, then you have the double contribution to risk and would see the kind of patterns that you're seeing. So I don't know, but I can imagine some scenarios that would explain it.
Yeah, okay, thank you. My second question is about the mutations, possible mutations about the virus. A couple of days here, it appeared some news about a new variant here in Chile. It's called the Andina variant. I think they still haven't, I've found some cases in Peru and here in Chile. My question is about these mutations, these variants from the virus. Should we expect them to be just more contagious, or should we be worried for new symptoms, for example, or something even more dangerous?
It's a good question. There is a risk that they will be, though keep in mind that a successful parasite, there's no advantage to the parasite in killing your host. If you're sufficiently infectious, then you may get away with it, like smallpox. Or if you manage to, or you really don't need the host, like anthrax, you can kill the host, sporulate, go to soil. You really didn't need that host to begin with. But if you're coronavirus and you need a host to survive, there's no advantage in killing that host, at least until you manage to be transmitted to another host. So it remains to be seen which of these variants vary in infectiousness, pathogenicity, or in resistance, if that's the right word, to antibody, such that they avoid antibody produced by natural infection or immunization. But those scenarios are the risk we run when the infection rates are high, because then, as I described, the odds are that there'll be a mutation that arises that may alter the virus's capabilities in some ways that are unfavorable for us.
Yeah, but as you said, basically a virus that kills the host too fast is not effective at transmitting itself. So basically it will be less successful than another variant, perhaps, that is milder but has a much higher capacity to infect.
Right, and you'll see that herpes viruses, for example, and hepatitis viruses are examples of where acute disease, it can be terrible, but in the main, there has been an evolution towards a chronic carrier state where the virus survives and the host does too.
In the meantime, between the chronic carrier state where the host survives and what's emerging, there is one thing to point out, and that is that a more effectively infectious version that has the same rate of morbidity and mortality, i.e. sickness and death, the more people you infect, it's going to cause more people to die, because that's just how math works. So yes, I don't want that to be confused.
Right. That's a very good point.
Oh, thank you.
Go ahead,
Thank
Bob.
you.
I think I see you wanting
I
to speak.
got a question online saying, will there be conventions in the future, Star Trek conventions, if we manage them with new protocols? In other words, if we have social distancing, wherever the convention is happening, and whatever the state of viral transmission seems to be in that community, we will obviously either have the convention or not have it based on the whether or not we can have it safely. So I get asked this question a lot. Of course, I don't have the answer, but I believe that moving forward, like any other large in-person event with large crowds of people, it's going to be on people's minds, and it'll change going forward, so that perhaps the autograph line will be managed differently, and so that people can socially distance. I do know that I was on the last Star Trek cruise right before the first case of COVID in this country. In fact, while we were at sea on the cruise with about 3,500 Star Trek fans, the very first infection was announced in Manhattan. And on that cruise, which thankfully, to my knowledge, no one got seriously ill during or after it, we had no handshaking, and we had Vulcan salutes and elbow bumps only. And I do believe that helped certainly manage even less serious infections like passing the colds and everything. It was a very smart thing to do. So moving forward, I will say this: I'm not going to shake every hand that comes at me at in-person events, because you can give just as warm a greeting with a Vulcan salute or an elbow bump. And I'm a practicing Catholic, and we no longer shake hands when we offer each other the sign of peace during the Catholic Mass. We now wave to each other from a distance. So you can still have the same gesture of friendship and community safely.
Beautifully said, Bob. That brings me to thinking about adaptation. And what's really important about all of this is that we all still have to live our lives, and we are all still human beings in the world who miss each other very much in some cases, because some of us have been apart from each other for a long time. And the adaptation that you're talking about of, okay, well, this is, how are we going to do this next that's safely? There are going to be some major cultural changes as things go by. Like, I don't think I ever want to shake someone's hand again, for example. I like this. I'm also a fan of bowing or curtsying because I'm a Jane Austen fan, but that's just me. There are lots and lots of ways to greet each other warmly that are much safer. And I really appreciate your point on that, Bob.
By the way, I will have to sign off soon. I will try to look in on the party later, but I have another responsibility coming up in about 3 minutes. So
understood. We thank you for joining us, Bob. It's been a real pleasure to have you here.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed it. It was a pleasure listening to you, Gary, and to meet you virtually. And thank you, Commander. And I'm not quite sure of your rank. Are you an ensign, Gary?
Yeah, I'm not in full uniform. I don't have my pips. I'm commander, first officer to the captain.
Oh, forgive me. Oh, I'm so embarrassed now. I'll never be invited on the starship again. What a faux pas. I'm sorry.
You know what we said about forgiveness earlier?
I was going to say forgiveness is real. Yeah.
I did not know. I assumed, because of my own experience in Starfleet, that the woman was the captain.
She is.
I am.
Officer.
She
you
is
are.
I am.
Okay. So you are the captain, and you are the first officer?
I
completely misheard what you just said. All right, this is why I don't work in Starfleet anymore, guys. I just got too old to understand the protocols. Anyway, my best to everyone. Think seriously about this discussion. Try to influence family and friends who are hesitant about getting the vaccine, because our future as a community depends on everyone doing their share and getting vaccinated. That is what I'm hoping for, and I'm hoping you will spread that message gently. Don't argue with people. just have calm, reasoned conversation with them, and hopefully they will come to believe that it is their best way to be part of our human family, is to protect all of us.
Thank you very
I
much,
want
Bob.
to say
for
real quick,
coming.
thank you, Bob. I did grab some screenshots of you guys during the convention, so we'll make sure Dan or somebody can get those to you.
Excellent. I appreciate it. Live long and prosper, all.
Peace and long life. All right, perfect. I think we had one more question, and I think it's probably getting toward party time.
Now, I'd suggest we close with two questions from two of Kelvin's students.
That's a wonderful way to wrap up. Let's hear them.
Roby and Melvin both have questions that also involve the episode we just watched.
Excellent. We'll do our best, although the expert just left.
It's not about filming techniques.
Oh, okay.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, my name is Melvin.
Hi, Melvin.
My question was, are there any known macro viruses known to man?
Excellent. Are there any macroviruses? That's really a good question. Gary, I want to say that I read somewhere that there were large viruses that were buried in the permafrost in the Arctic regions, but I do not know of any such like this, unless you do.
No, and since they're intracellular inhabitants, that would be tough physics to pull off. I know of none.
Okay. You tell the question. But Star Trek
But
as
we will
well.
always keep looking.
Yeah.
So did we have another question from you guys?
Yes, we do. So my question is relating to the coronavirus and the microvirus. I was wondering if the contagious stages were the same or similar.
Can you repeat your question? I think you were breaking up just a little bit. We couldn't hear you clearly.
Is the contagious stage between the macrovirus and coronavirus the same?
Oh, very interesting question. So the macrovirus that you saw on Voyager is fiction. There are none. So, but I think what you're asking about is the mechanism of transmission, as in how is it spread, right?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yes.
It's not quite the same mode of transmission as Voyager's is science fiction. It's fake. It's made up as a story. But what's relevant about that is that there was a fluid involved. In this case, it was a mucilaginous compound on Voyager, and in our case, it's snot, human snot. So those two things are related. And the idea of keeping the goo off of you, i.e., don't get the mucilaginous compound on you, or don't get other people's snot in you, it's the same concept. Gary, anything to add?
Nope. If it looks yucky, it is. Don't get it on you.
Yeah.
And it may be, depending on the infectious dose, which we've discussed, it has an influence on how well you should trust your eyes. So, but as a guiding principle, you don't need someone else to tell you that something is potentially infectious. Your own assessment is valuable.
Okay, thanks. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Definitely. If you think it's gross, don't get it on you. Our human ability to determine what is gross is highly refined. Trust it. And on that highly elevated note, I think it might be party time. Dan?
I do believe that is my cue.
That is your cue, sir.
Fantastic. Hello, everybody. This has been such an incredible event. I have to say, first off, the best piece of advice tonight. I mean, we've learned a lot of things that people thought they knew were either confirmed or debunked. And I think that's fantastic. It's the point. But I think the most amazing advice, the smartest advice we've heard today just happened with Dr. Preston saying, just don't get any on you. I wanted to make sure I quoted that exactly, sir. Just don't get any on you. Solves the whole problem.
Yeah, the personal assessment, if it looks yucky, it is.
Yeah, trust your instincts, everyone. If it looks yucky, just don't rub it all over your face because you don't want that. Right. I also would like to say, everyone, please, let's give a virtual round of applause right now for the captain, Barbara McDonald, for putting this event together. This, I mean, it's the first event of its kind. When Bob Picardo heard the pitch for it, his response was actually, why hasn't anyone done this yet? This is such a great idea. And I'm sure everyone saw from Bob's social media posts and just his interaction today, how true to that sentiment his feelings were. So Barbara, you knocked it out of the park. I mean, I don't know the equivalent in spring ball of knocking it out of the park. I'm more of a Jake Sisko noggin the holosuite with a baseball bat, but really, congratulations. This has been fantastic. Very well done.
Thank you very much, Dan, for the acknowledgement. And I see everybody in the chat. I see that. Thank you so much. I'm just glad that I could contribute. I've been wanting to figure out what could I do? What could I do? What could I do? I've been sitting on that since the beginning of the pandemic. And I want to thank our partners because I didn't do this alone. I may have thought it up, but this would not have happened without gaze in space. I'm sorry, I can't not do that. Without our officers, our fellow officers on the Inspire at Watch Trek, without the USS Aaron Eisenberg, and definitely not without, certainly not without Galaxis Aerospace and Inara, who has been, she's been standing right beside me, as have all of you, to make this happen. So thank you, and I got the acknowledgement. Party!
Party, yes. Now, also, I feel like everyone who's still with us, which another thing, by the way, through this whole event, pretty much everyone who started with us at the beginning have stayed to the end. And I mean, that would have been just impressive this time last year. This year, as people are suffering from serious Zoom fatigue, it is the biggest compliment you could possibly get. So just wanted to point that out. And also to say that everyone who is still with us, Barbara may be questioning whether or not she needs to do this again. You think, if you agree that yes, in fact, she does, please put that in the chat so that later on, when I am speaking privately with her to convince her of it, I can have that as backup. Just saying.
Dan, you do know how to twist my arm, and there's someone else that I really want to make sure that I thank vigorously, and that is Gary Preston. You are a highly esteemed person in my life. I am honored to work for you. To work with you, to be standing beside you and doing work that's important in the world. And I appreciate you coming. And by the way, the same is true for Paul, even if he's not here to hear it. But Gary, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. And I would again point out, this is an unsolicited promotion, that the future sessions of Casperia are directly related to how effectively we may actually and implement the sort of work that we need to do together and as related to COVID and much else. So go forth and do good things. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. And I will point out that on our website, watchtrek-lookforward.com or whatever it is, someone will put that in the chat. All of those events are available and open for registration. We will talk about what's important to humanity. And yes, what's important to humanity definitely relates to how we manage this issue. We talk monthly. It is a Zoom call, and you are invited and welcome, and please come.
Thank you all.
Link is in the chat.
Thank you, Doctor.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Preston, for being here. And if you're going to be around for a bit, we are about to share the first Trek-inspired musical performance about COVID that Gaze in Space ever created. So if you can hang with us for another 2 minutes or so, I think it's going to be worth your time, sir. I think you're going to enjoy it.
Again, I thank you for the invitation. I have small ones demanding attention, but they will hold them at bay. And if you see me disappear, it's not from lack of interest. Thank you.